Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining ITI's VPAT training session, a practical guide to reporting accessibility conformance using the VPAT. My name is Julie Zaklis-Antow, and I lead accessibility work here at ITI. For those who are not familiar with our work, the Information Technology Industry Council is the premier global advocate for technology, representing the world's most innovative companies. Founded in 1916, ITI is an international trade association with a team of professionals on 4 continents. We promote public policies and industry standards that advance competition and innovation worldwide. Our diverse membership and expert staff provide policymakers with the broadest perspectives and thought leadership from technology, hardware, software, services, and related industries. This session is being recorded and will be available on ITI's website alongside the training's PowerPoint presentation. It is now my pleasure to give the stage over to our incredible Accessibility Policy Committee members and highly experienced accessibility experts, Mary Jo Mueller and Steve Kerr, to get our training started.
Welcome to the ITI VPAT training. This is a refreshed course from the one we published a few years ago. I'm Mary Jo Mueller, and I'm IBM's Accessibility Standards Program Manager and the chair of ITI's VPAT committee.
Hello, I'm Steve Kerr. I'm an accessibility analyst with Google. I'm currently serving as the vice chair for ITI's Accessibility Committee, and my VPAT experience has been in both the public and private sectors, from reviewing ACRs in a procurement process to filling out VPATs during the product development.
In case you didn't receive this information earlier, the slides are available for download from the ITI website. You can use either the QR code or the link that's provided on this slide. I think we'll provide the link in the chat as well. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that if at any time you have a question, there's a Q&A button that you can find in the center of the toolbar ribbon at the bottom of the meeting window. Julie from ITI will be gathering the questions during the presentation, and then after we're done with our presentation part of the webinar, we'll take a 5-minute break, followed by time that we've already set aside to answer as many questions as we have time for. So let's get started with a quick poll. What is your level of experience with the VPAT? This can help us tune the presentation and give examples that are most meaningful to you. I'll give you a couple minutes to complete the poll. All right, so there's quite a number of you. We had 106 votes. 51% or 54 of you are beginners, where 39% or 41 of you are intermediate, and 10% are expert. So this is going to be a good webinar for those of you who are beginners and intermediates, and hopefully even the experts can learn something as well. Right, so what are the goals of this training? This training aims to give you a better understanding of accessibility conformance reports that are created using the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT. We'll cover how they're used, how to write a conformance report using the VPAT, and what to look for when you're reviewing an accessibility conformance report. We'll not be providing training on accessibility standards, specific criteria or requirements, and we won't be covering how to test for accessibility, only on how to use the VPAT to report your test results. We also won't be providing any compliance information regarding what you need to do to meet regulations. As its name indicates, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template is a template, and it's used to create accessibility conformance reports. It's pre-filled with some instructions and the accessibility standards and guidelines criteria. An accessibility conformance report, or ACR, is a VPAT that's been fully completed. It's the result of filling out the template with the results of your product evaluation against the accessibility standards. It is a report that lists any accessibility conformance issues with the product. It is not a certification. The VPAT was initially developed as a procurement tool to help government buyers determine the accessibility of IT products and services. It provides a framework for reporting on a product's conformance to standards. By using a standardized template, buyers can more easily compare products to ensure they're purchasing the most accessible product for their teams. Can accessibility conformance of a product be summed up to a simple yes or no? The short answer is no. One of the benefits of the VPAT is that it allows you to view conformance details for each criteria in a standard. Accessibility standards are complex, and a product that is accessible to one user may not be so accessible to another. Minor accessibility issues can still exist in an otherwise accessible product. The ACR helps demonstrate a degree of conformance, which can be more helpful than expecting a yes or no answer on if a product conforms to a standard. Most software has issues, including accessibility issues. It's a huge difference between a no for a product that ignored accessibility altogether and a no where a good bit of time and attention was given to accessibility, but there's still some remaining issues. For more information on why this is important, please check out ITI's Reporting Conformance to ICT Accessibility Standards resource, linked from the slides. Many different organizations produce ACRs using the VPAT. This includes companies that do business with governments or government agencies, information and communications technology-related companies, which range from small to large corporations, as well as manufacturers and suppliers who want or need to provide ACRs for their products and services. Using the VPAT is the de facto method for reporting product conformance to accessibility standards. Who reads ACRs? ACRs are often read by procurers. This can include people making purchasing decisions for federal governments and are also used in the procurement processes of many international government agencies. ACRs are used in sectors where accessibility is a priority, such as for private sector corporations or in education, banking, transportation, many other business sectors. Also, they are often read by consumers. If you want to better understand if a product is accessible for your needs, an ACR can be a helpful resource before purchase. The VPAT is currently available in 4 editions. The WCAG edition includes all the versions of WCAG 2, including 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. The 508 edition includes the revised 508 standards and WCAG 2.0. The EU version includes the EN 301549 version 3.2.1, as well as WCAG 2.1. The INT, or international version, includes all of the above in one template. These templates can be found on the ITI VPAT page, which is linked from the slides. ITI publishes the latest version of the 4 VPAT editions on their website. They are regularly updated to ensure the latest requirements are included, so we encourage you to always use the latest version of the template when working on the accessibility of your product or service. So which edition should you use? That depends on a few things. What are the requirements of your customers? Are there any existing requirements in your organization? Do you do business internationally or only with a specific region? What accessibility standards do you evaluate against? These questions can help you determine what template you should use. If you're unsure about what to use the INT edition. Early on in your product development, you'll need to decide on which WCAG version you want to be testing and reporting on in your ACR. You also need to decide what WCAG levels you'll be testing against. All 3 levels of criteria within WCAG, level A, AA, AAA, or are you going to do a combination, level A and AA? Note that the revised Section 508 requires WCAG 2.0 at the level AA, while EN 301549 requires WCAG 2.1 at the AA level. Other jurisdictions, like the United Kingdom, are starting to require WCAG 2.2 at the level AA. Be sure to check the ITI website for the latest version of the VPAT and for the edition that you want to report on. The VPAT versions change over time due to changes in standards, which is indicated with an uptick of the numeric version number. For example, VPAT 2.5 was the version used when WCAG 2.2 criteria were added. Versions that are marked with REV, like the upcoming 2.5 Rev, don't have any requirements changes to indicate. So it indicates that there are not substantive changes. So the instructions or, there's some editorial or formatting changes in the VPAT. Though you don't fill in the VPAT at the beginning of a product cycle, if you have tooling that automatically builds your ACRs, you may want to make updates in preparation for filling it in. Noting an update to the version number also lets you know when standards have changed that you might need to support, especially for new products or major product updates, where you might need to update your test plans to ensure products are up to date with the most current requirements. Knowing what file format you'll want to deliver your product ACRs in and how you want to make them available can help you plan for testing and be ready for customer requests for accessibility information. You can directly use the VPAT, which is in Microsoft Word, and deliver your product ACRs in that format, or HTML or PDF might be the right delivery format for you. Whatever format you use, make sure the final document is accessible. Plan early for how customers might obtain your product ACRs and whether they are viewable or downloadable from your website or made available on request, or only provided when you're directly responding to a bid. This helps you have the right people and process in place before your product hits the market.
Preparing to write the ACR. When should you write your product's ACR? This might depend on the process in your organization, but the ACR should represent the accessibility of the product that will be released. This needs to occur after you've done accessibility testing. If your product will go through some rounds of bug fixing before release, it's important to ensure that the ACR remains updated and accurately represents the product at the time of release. The planning for your ACR can start early. Focusing on accessibility in the design, development, and testing processes will help make the process of writing an ACR easier. The ACR should be written by people who are involved with the product development, who have access to the accessibility testing results, and who are familiar with accessibility. As someone who's worked with a lot of different ACRs, it can be easy to identify when one has been completed by someone who's unfamiliar with the accessibility criteria. The ACR is a technical document based on a product's test results and capabilities. It's not a marketing document. Determine what your product has. If your product has documentation, help centers, support services such as a contact form or live chat client, these must be evaluated and reported on as well. Consider the various aspects of your product that users will be able to access. Have you evaluated these parts of your product? Sometimes a product might contain third-party content, such as a social media widget or a third-party payment processor on the checkout page of an online marketplace. These situations can be approached in a few different ways, depending on how they're incorporated into your product. If it's integrated into your product and users can't determine if it's a separate product, then test the content and report it in your ACR. If the user can determine that it's a separate product, you can include this in the notes section of the report. You should also include a link to the Accessibility Conformance Report of that third-party product if it's available. Minimum required sections of an ACR. The VPAT lists out a series of required sections. This includes basic information for the product, including the name and version number, the date the ACR was completed, a description of the product, the contact information, and the evaluation methods that were used. The applicable standards and guidelines section must indicate which standards or guidelines are covered in the ACR. The terms section must include the definitions of the terms that are used in the ACR, such as supports, partially supports, etc. And the evaluation tables, such as the WCAG report, Section 508 report, and EN 301549 report, depending on which VPAT edition you're using. And then the additional optional sections of an ACR. Consider whether any of the optional parts of the ACR are appropriate for you to include, such as if you want to include your company branding in the header, or if you're amending an existing report, you might want to list the changes that were made and the date that it was last updated. If there are dependencies on other ACRs, they can be documented in the notes section, and you can add any legal disclaimers or information that your law team may want you to incorporate. The VPAT provides a number of different areas to add additional notes. There's a notes field in the product information section where you can provide notes on things at the product level. There are notes fields before each conformance table, which can be used for information specific to that section of the report. And in the EU 508 and INT templates, there's a note section at the start of each standard where you could add notes on specific information related to that standard. In the examples on this slide, we're showing the notes section in the product information section of the report, as well as an example of how the notes section can be used when a specific section of the 508 template was removed. The table for Chapter 4 hardware was removed, and the notes field for this section states, these criteria are all not applicable because the product is not hardware. Evaluation methods used. When people are reviewing your ACRs, they'll often look to the evaluation methods used section to get more information on how the testing was done. This can provide context to the information that's provided throughout the report. When the ACR is being reviewed as part of a procurement, it can provide the reader information that is important to their purchasing decision, such as how thorough the testing was, did the testing involve just automated tools or was there manual testing involved, details of any manual testing that was conducted, such as keyboard-only testing, was assistive technology included in the testing process, how was the testing scope defined, if the report includes the 508 standard, was the trusted tester process followed, if the report includes the EN 301-549 standard, were the tests provided in the Annex C of the EN followed? And did the product testing include the use of a third-party testing company? And if so, which one and which process did they follow? The technical criteria are covered in the evaluation tables. The tables have 3 columns. 2 of them need to be completed. The conformance level, which implements the levels defined in the terms section of the report, and the remarks and explanations column. The remarks and explanations column should include information regarding the testing of each criteria, as well as any specific details on any issues that were encountered during testing. This column may also include workarounds to the issues that were identified and how a customer can find out more information about the accessibility issues. The following are the conformance level terms used in the VPAT. Supports says the functionality of the product has at least one method that meets the criterion without known defects or it meets with equivalent facilitation. Partially supports is some functionality of the product does not meet the criterion. Does not support, the majority of product functionality does not meet the criterion. Not applicable, the criterion is not relevant to the product. And not evaluated, the product has not been evaluated against the criterion. This can only be used in WCAG level AAA criteria. And some tips for making the file shorter. Sometimes ACRs can get quite lengthy once they're filled in, and there are reasonable ways to make it shorter even before you start filling it out. We had previously said that you need to determine what your product has. If there's a table of requirements that don't apply, you can remove it rather than answering not applicable to all of the requirements in the table. For example, if you're reporting on Section 508 conformance on a web-only product and the product has no hardware, you can remove the hardware table to shorten the report and then provide the simple note that says this section does not apply to the product as there are no hardware components.
So now we're going to switch gears to talk more specifically about each VPAT edition, starting with the WCAG edition of the VPAT. WCAG is a standard developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. Its long name is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You might also hear it called WCAG, 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 or something similar. We're all referring to the same standard, which sets requirements for making web content accessible to people with disabilities. Outside of the web, WCAG requirements, with a few exceptions, are being applied in non-web contexts, such as to non-web software, user interfaces, to electronic documentation, and to tools used to author web content and electronic documents. WCAG has 3 actively used versions: WCAG 2.0 from 2008, WCAG 2.1 from 2018, and WCAG 2.2 from 2023. Each of these WCAG versions includes 3 levels. We've been talking about that: Level A, AA, and AAA. The levels are actually cumulative. So for example, if you plan to report on level AA conformance, you need to include all level A and AA criteria. Most regulations require level AA. WCAG conformance is used in regulations such as the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AOTA, the recent Department of Justice rule on the accessibility of state and local government websites and mobile applications, Section 508, and the European Accessibility Act, and many more. If you want to report on the very latest version of WCAG, you need to use either the WCAG version or of the VPAT or the INT, or international version. This is because the 508 edition only includes WCAG 2.0, and the EU edition includes WCAG 2.1. Each of the WCAG standards are listed separately in the table in the Accessibility Standards and Guidelines section. And when you're filling out the VPAT, you need to adjust the values for each level in the Included in Report column to reflect the WCAG versions and the levels that you're reporting on. This slide gives you a partial view of the WCAG 2.x report, showing a few success criteria for WCAG level A in Table 1 and for level AA in Table 2. The VPAT indicates criteria that were added after WCAG 2.0. Note that in the criteria column, whenever there's no explanation of what WCAG version the criterion is from, it came from WCAG 2.0. Because the VPAT includes WCAG 2.2, when the new criteria were introduced by WCAG 2.1, the VPAT adds the text 2.1 and 2.2 because those exist in both after the level information. So you can easily identify them. And not shown here in the slide, but the notation is similar when there were brand new criteria only in WCAG 2.2. Those criteria have the additional text 2.2 only after the level information. The WCAG AAA criteria are also provided in a separate table, but these are optional. If you decide to use the international version or INT version of the VPAT, you'll notice that the WCAG tables include a mapping to the specific clauses of the EN 301549 that require WCAG conformance, as well as revised Section 508 mapping, since WCAG is also applied in non-web contexts. The conformance level and remarks and explanations also allow for indicating what aspects of your product meet the WCAG criteria. We'll cover that more when we talk about the other editions. So what if you were using the WCAG edition VPAT, but you only plan to report on WCAG 2.0? You can handle this in one of two ways. The first way is to put not applicable in the conformance level column for each criteria marked with 2.2 only or with 2.1 and 2.2. In this example, it shows 2.5.1 pointer gestures through 2.5.4 motion actuation that all have not applicable notated in the conformance level with a comment of not reporting on WCAG 2.1 or 2.2. So that's one way to handle it. Or instead of marking these criteria not applicable, you could delete them from the tables. One thing to remember, whenever you're not reporting on a particular level of WCAG or a particular WCAG version, make sure that the applicable standards or guidelines section of the report lists only the standards that you are reporting against. So you would report no on those others. Some companies want to combine the WCAG criteria into a single table, and that's okay. In this example, we show the combination of single A and AA criteria in one table and change the title to Table 1 WCAG Success Criteria. Having a single table may shorten the report, but it can also lead to a longer table. So let's say you have a product and you're focused on reporting on WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 only to level AA. So you don't plan on reporting level AAA conformance. In the applicable standards and guidelines table, and then in the WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 rows, you would mark yes for level A and yes for level AA, and then no for level AAA in the included in report column. Continuing with this example, you may be wondering what to do with a level AAA table when you're not reporting conformance to those criteria. And again, this can be handled in two ways. The first way is you can fill in the conformance level for all the level AAA criteria with not evaluated answer. And this is the only valid use for not evaluated. So don't use it in any of the other tables. The second way is to remove table 3 for level AAA criteria altogether. And in the notes for that section, indicate the table was removed and why. So in this example, the remarks and explanations comments say, this product has not been tested for conformance to WCAG AAA criteria.
All right, 508 Edition VPAT. And just before we get into this, I just want to give another reminder that we have a Q&A button on the interface. If you want any questions, please add them at any time, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Section 508 refers to an amendment to a U.S. federal law, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This law requires federal agencies and entities receiving federal funds to make their technologies accessible to people with disabilities. The requirements for procuring accessible technology are the revised Section 508 standards, which are set by the U.S. Access Board. The revised Section 508 standard is available on the U.S. Access Board's website. For reporting on the revised Section 508 standard, the criteria are included in the 508 and INT editions of the VPAT. For the 508 edition of the VPAT, the applicable standards and guidelines section lists out WCAG 2.0 at level AA, as well as the revised Section 508 standard as being applicable. These are pre-filled, as this template is specific to the 508 requirements. There's a yes/no option at the WCAG level AAA for you to indicate whether or not you're reporting on the AAA criteria, since they're optional. If you plan to use the International or INT edition of the VPAT to report on conformance to the revised Section 508 standards, be sure to update the applicable standards and guidelines table to indicate which of the INT standards you're reporting on. For reporting on 508, this would mean updating the WCAG 2.0 to yes for levels A and AA, as well as yes for the revised Section 508 standards row. Depending on what other standards you're reporting on, such as the EN 301549, you might need to adjust the other rows accordingly. We often receive questions about why we don't create a 508 and WCAG 2.1 or a 508 and WCAG 2.2 VPAT. These standards are already incorporated into the INT edition, so if this is something that you're interested in, you can use the INT VPAT as your starting point. The WCAG tables within the 508 template list the mapping of the WCAG criteria to the various provisions in the revised Section 508 standards. The conformance level and remarks and explanations columns also feature a few different categories which are aligned with the 508 requirements. These columns need to be filled out with the applicable conformance level and remarks and explanations for each applicable type of technology. The 508 standard provides some exceptions for scenarios where specific WCAG criteria do not apply. For non-web documents and software, these criteria are 2.4.1 bypass blocks, 2.4.5 multiple ways, 3.2.3 consistent navigation, and 3.2.4 consistent identification. In the VPAT, these are indicated in the criteria column by saying does not apply, and in the example here for 3.2.3 consistent navigation, the provision 501 is marked as does not apply to non-web software, and 602.3 is marked as does not apply to non-web docs. The revised Section 508 report section of the 508 VPAT has tables for each of the chapters in the standard that contain requirements. Chapter 3 is for functional performance criteria, Chapter 4 is for hardware, Chapter 5 is for software, and Chapter 6 is for support documentation and services. Another important item to note in the VPAT is that some provisions within revised 508 are headings with no specific requirements to conform to. These headings provide context for the requirements that follow. We included them in the VPAT, and we call your attention to them by making them gray cells with the heading text, heading cell, no response required, in the conformance level and in the remarks and explanations columns. This should help when filling in the VPAT. Only the empty cells in those columns need to be filled out with your test results. If there's a situation where there's a functionality that's not covered by the revised 508 standards, or if you're claiming equivalent facilitation as it's defined in the E204.1 and E101.2, you can use the functional performance criteria. These criteria cover functional performance in a variety of categories, such as without vision, with limited hearing, with without hearing, with limited manipulation, and others. Some of the 508 requirements reference WCAG, such as the Software 501.1 scope provision and the 602.3 electronic support documentation provision. The 508 VPAT redirects users to the WCAG 2.x section, where the revised 508 standards require WCAG conformance. It is an option if you wanted to integrate the WCAG tables into these sections, but it will make the report longer. Documentation and support services are also considered a part of your product, and they need to be evaluated. 602 support documentation and 603 support services feature requirements for these parts of your product. Remember that WCAG is not just for web, it's also used for electronic documents.
So now we'll go through the features of the EU edition of the VPAT. The EU edition was created to support the EN 301-549 standard, which is titled Accessibility Requirements for ICT Products and Services. It's used in many regulations as the basis for accessibility requirements in many countries, including the European Union, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, India, and Kenya. If you are reporting conformance to the EN 301-549 standard, you can use either the EU or the INT editions of the VPAT. For the EU edition of the VPAT, the applicable standards and guidelines table has been pre-assigned that WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 levels A and AA criteria are included in the report, as well as the EN 301-549. The included in report section indicates yes for those items. So if you will also be reporting conformance to level AAA criteria for either WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 or both, then indicate yes for those. If not, indicate no. Similar to the 508 edition, the WCAG report section of the EU edition includes references to the related EN clauses, as well as different categories in the conformance level and remarks and explanations column, based on the requirements in the EN 301-549 standard. In this example, the WCAG criteria for 1.1.1 non-text content and 1.2.1 audio only and video only pre-recorded reference the corresponding EN 301-549 clauses, and the conformance level and remarks and explanations columns include categories for web, electronic docs, software, closed functionality, and authoring tools. This makes it easy to report the WCAG conformance results for these aspects of your products in one table. Also similar to 508, the EN 301-549 does not require all WCAG criteria for non-web documents and software. The criteria that are not to be evaluated are clearly shown in the VPAT with the text does not apply. The example here is 2.4.2 page titled, which the EN 301-549 lists as void in their standard in clause 11 software. So in the VPAT, it's marked as does not apply in the criteria column. And in the software category has been removed from the conformance level and remarks and explanations columns. In the EN 301-549, there are some exceptions for a number of WCAG criteria, meaning they're not required. The EN 301-549 is a little inconsistent in the language that they use when they have an exception, noting them as void or does not have to meet or not applicable. It varies. One example is 2.4.1 bypass blocks, where non-web documents and software, including closed functionality software, are not required to meet the criterion. A more unusual example is 2.4.2 page titled, where documents are required to meet the criterion, but software is not. All of these exceptions are reflected in the WCAG tables of the VPAT with the notation does not apply. The one unique item I want to point out with WCAG 2.0 and 2.1, they changed 4.1.1 parsing to indicate the criteria is automatically met. So the VPAT does the same and marks those as supports in the conformance level column. In addition to the WCAG tables, the EU also features tables for the various clauses in the EN 301549 standard. Tables are provided for each clause from Clause 4, Functional Performance Statement, to Clause 13, ICT providing relay or emergency service access. So this is a sample table from the EU VPAT showing Clause 5, generic requirements. Similar to other tables where a clause is not setting a requirement, it's clearly marked as a heading cell, no response required. Similarly, with clauses that are covered by more detailed requirements, a reference is added, like 5.1.2.1 closed functionality, which points the user to clauses 5.2 through 13. WCAG conformance is handled similar to 508 in int editions. Clauses 9, 10, and 11 in the EN 301549 have requirements for WCAG conformance for web content, non-web documents, and software and documentation support services. And the EU VPAT redirects readers to the WCAG 2.x section. Likewise, the clause 12 for documentation and support services handled in that same manner with a document link to the WCAG 2.x report section. Optionally, you can integrate the WCAG tables into each of these clauses if you desire. As with other VPAT editions, tables that don't apply can be removed. Don't forget to write some notes for the section where the tables or requirements were removed and indicate why.
And just another reminder that if you have any questions, there is a Q&A functionality on the interface, and any questions that you ask can be submitted through that, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. All right, what makes a good ACR? Accuracy is important because an ACR can become a legal document if it's used in a bid or contract. You want to make truthful statements about the accessibility of the product that are representative of the accessibility testing that has been done. It's a best practice to have the ACR reviewed by whoever's responsible for managing compliance and risk for the product. This is a checklist of what needs to be done before making the ACR available. Most of these checklist items are described in the introductory slides of this presentation. These include ensuring that the ACR is complete, accurate, descriptive, and accessible, as well as some housekeeping items such as deleting the instructions from the document. A good product description should provide enough details for users to understand the product as it was evaluated. It should tell the reader if anything was excluded from testing, such as mobile software versions of the product, third-party social media widgets, or specific product integrations or add-ons that are reported in a separate ACR. It should also provide links to ACRs of any of these types of products if they are not tested within the scope of this report. For contact information, people might have questions about the information in your report or where to find an updated version of your report. It's important to remember that these are not marketing documents, and if users reach out to the contact that's listed in your ACR, they should be able to obtain answers to accessibility questions. Rather than using a specific individual as the contact, we recommend you use a group email address of the team responsible for the accessibility of the product. This can help ensure that inquiries can get a prompt response when the author of the report is not available. Evaluation methods used. When reviewing an ACR, people pay close attention to the evaluation methods used section to determine if you've done sufficient testing that supports the results in the ACR. The VPAT provides instructions on what types of things you should be describing when filling out this section. The more detail provided, the easier it'll be for readers to understand how the product will work within their teams, as well as helping to identify how thorough the testing was. As an example, if you know that you have a team member who relies on keyboard navigation and a report lists manual keyboard-only testing as one of the evaluation methods that were used, it can give you more confidence that the report indicates the issues that your users might encounter. This should give you enough context to review the issues in the report and determine how usable the product will be within your team. The applicable standards and guidelines table is different in each edition of the VPAT. The WCAG and INT editions include all of the WCAG versions, but the 508 edition only includes WCAG 2.0, and the EN edition includes WCAG 2.0 and 2.1, because these are the versions that are required by each standard. Make sure you adjust the yes or no answers in the included in report column to reflect what you are or are not reporting conformance to. In this example, using the INT edition, we're reporting on all of the standards except for the WCAG AAA criteria. Conformance levels. Use one of the conformance levels that are provided in the VPAT. This includes supports, partially supports, does not support, or not applicable. As I mentioned earlier, not evaluated is a special answer that can only be used in the WCAG AAA criteria if you're not testing or reporting on those criteria. WCAG allows a response of supports instead of not applicable for criteria that don't apply to your product. In a good ACR, these conformance levels are used, and they're supported by the comments in the remarks and explanations column. Remarks and explanations are required for any criteria with a conformance level of partially supports or does not support. Some companies provide this information for all conformance levels, and that's okay. It's important that these explanations identify what features or functionality don't meet the requirements and how they don't meet them. In the example on this slide, for WCAG 1.1.1 non-text content, we have a partially supports conformance level with explanations explaining the issues that were found. In this case, we have 3 items listed. 2 of them provide details on issues regarding alternative text for images, and the third one explains that there is an accessible alternative provided for inaccessible content. This type of information can be valuable to include because it informs readers that steps have been taken to provide an accessible experience for users. The best practices for the remarks and explanations. If there are specific scenarios where an issue presents itself, or if specific testing steps were used for a specific criterion, you can document these in the remarks and explanations. If there's a specific issue with a publicly available bug, you could provide a link to the bug so users can track it and get additional information. If there are any workarounds for accessibility issues, you can also document them here. Here's an example of a good remarks and explanations for WCAG's 2.1.1 keyboard. It says, all interactive content can be reached and operated using a keyboard. This informs you that this criterion is supported by the product. It also says, known issue. The search box is skipped when tabbing through the content. It can be reached by using Shift Tab from the name field. So this demonstrates that an issue was found, but it also provides a workaround for users to be able to access the functionality. Obviously, having this issue isn't ideal, but as a reader, it informs you that they're aware of the issue, that there are ways to access the accessibility. There are ways to access the functionality before the accessibility issue is resolved. Now we're going to show you a couple examples of good and bad ACR content. This hardware ACR is good because it uses the terms that are defined in the terms section of the report, which makes it easier to understand and compare products. The remarks and explanations content also aligns with these definitions, which can help demonstrate an understanding of the criteria and the terms. If I have just a quick moment to review an ACR, I'll look to see how they describe an issue. If it's described clearly in a way that I can understand the impact that it might have on a user. For this hardware ACR, the 508 criterion 402.2.4 user control is marked as partially supports. So let's read the explanation. It says, speech is automatically interrupted as the user navigates displayed text and items on the screen. There are controls to mute and repeat spoken prompts and information, but it cannot pause or continue speech. So in this case, the user is able to repeat the spoken prompt, but they can't continue it when it's interrupted. This is an issue that I can understand, and I can understand how it can affect people. So the partially supports conformance level also seems appropriate. This comment tells me a lot. One, that they've tested the product with assistive technology, that they're aware of issues with the speech output, and that they provided a temporary solution, the control to repeat the prompt, to ensure that users can still have access to that information. For a bad hardware ACR example, we'll use the same example as the previous slide. We've changed the terms supports, not applicable, and partially supports to the terms passes, irrelevant, and minor exceptions. These are not the terms that are provided in the terms section of the VPAT. The terms in the VPAT have been created with input from both governments and industry, and they allow for products to be compared against a similar baseline. If you're trying to purchase the most accessible product available, you would want these reports to be filled out using consistent terms and definitions to make it easier to make an informed decision. If you put yourself in a procurement situation where you are reviewing 5 products, and 4 of them use the VPAT terms for partially supports, and 1 uses minor exceptions, it can make it more difficult to compare this report against the others, and it raises concerns that they might not have been evaluated the same. Let's move to a good software ACR example. In this example, we have the following WCAG criteria marked as not applicable. 1.2.1, audio only and video only pre-recorded. 1.2.2, captions pre-recorded. 1.2.3, audio description or media alternative pre-recorded. These criteria include details in the remarks and explanations column that clearly state why it's not applicable. In this case, it's because there's no audio or video content in the product, so the remarks will state the application does not contain any synchronized media, or the application does not contain any audio only or video only content. This clearly supports the conformance level of not applicable. So to move to a bad software ACR example. In this example, not applicable is used repeatedly, but it does not align with the content in the remarks and explanations column. To pick an example, WCAG 1.2.3 audio description or media alternative is listed as not applicable, and it has remarks saying audio description for visual content are not provided. This gives me many questions about the quality of this report. One, it casts doubt on the understanding of the criterion. Audio descriptions are not necessarily required for visual content. It's only required for the video content in synchronized media. Audio descriptions are not required for all visual content, so this leads me to think that it might not have been tested properly, or it's been tested by someone who's not familiar with the requirements. Two, why is this content marked as not applicable if the author felt that it applied to any visual content on the page? Three, this criterion allows for a media alternative and does not necessarily require an audio description, but this isn't mentioned in the remarks, so I'm wondering if the tester properly understood the requirement. Four, the way this is written, it sounds more like a does not support than a not applicable, as the product does not provide any audio description, and the remark also doesn't identify any media alternatives. When we read the remarks and explanations for some of the other items on the table, it seems as though they should be marked as partially supports or does not support. Using the wrong terminology makes it more difficult for readers to assess how frequent and severe these issues might be in the product, and it also makes it more difficult to evaluate your products against others who use the terms properly. In this example, I think it also creates more questions than answers, which isn't an ideal way to represent a product.
So now that your ACR is filled out, what's next? Please, ACRs based on the VPAT are long enough. Remove the instructions as part of creating your ACR, including the table of contents. This will eliminate 9 to 10 pages in the length of your finished report. You should already have earlier decided what file format to deliver your product ACR in and how customers will get them. That was covered in slide 12. It's very important, though, to test your ACR as well as the process for your customers to request and get them to make sure the whole process and the ACR are accessible. Now we'll switch gears and learn some tips for reading and evaluating ACRs. We've broken this down to 7 steps, which we'll cover over the next several slides. Step 1, determine the standard needed. Depending on what regulatory or policy objectives you need to meet for your procurement process, there may be different standards or WCAG versions that will need to be in your ACR. Do you need WCAG only? If so, what version? Or do you need to meet Section 508 or the EN 301.549? Remember, WCAG has versions and levels. Level AA is the most commonly required. WCAG is cumulative, which means that if it's requiring level AA, that means all the level A and AA criteria would need to be reported in your ACR. Some companies publish a conformance report per standard, and some report on all of them in a single report. Either method of reporting should be acceptable. Step 2, was the correct VPAT template used? Make sure that what you received in the ACR is the right addition to cover the standards your organization needs to adhere to. The WCAG edition only has WCAG criteria, and 508 has the 508 requirements, including WCAG 2.0 level AA. The EU edition covers the EN 301.549, which includes WCAG 2.1 level AA. The INT edition covered all of the VPAT covered standards and should be accepted in all situations instead of requiring a specific single standard edition. You might receive multiple editions if the company's policy is to publish single standard ACRs. You'll also need to ensure that the product VPAT is as current as the standards you require as possible. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. I'm fighting a little cold. While vendors are advised to move up to the latest version of the VPAT template, I'm sorry. While vendors are advised to move up to the latest version of a VPAT template, they may not be completely ready if a new standard was just released with a corresponding version of the VPAT. It may not, I'm sorry. It may not even be possible if a product was developed prior to a change in the standards. To understand when requirements have changed in the VPAT, we change the numeric value for the file name. For example, version 2.5 of the VPAT, when there's no changes to the requirements and there are simply updates to the instructions or formatting, REV is used in the file name. So requiring vendors to update to this VPAT version is not necessary. ITI maintains a change tracking file on our VPAT webpage, so you can understand what changes were made to each version. Steve, can you pick up from here?
No problem. Just to pick up from where Mary Jo left off, this table is derived from the change tracking file that she just mentioned, and it shows when each new VPAT version has been incorporated, or when they incorporated the 508 EU and INT editions. It demonstrates that even though the VPAT version might have changed, you don't necessarily need to ask for the latest VPAT if the criteria within it haven't changed for the standard of interest to you. As a quick example, the revised Section 508 requirements haven't changed since 2017, so any VPAT version 2.2 and later all have all of the relevant requirements for the 508, if that's the only thing that you're focusing on. Step 3, ensure the ACR is current. Often an ACR is scoped to a particular semantic version or versions of a product. If a product uses semantic versioning, make sure that the ACR that you're analyzing is reasonably close to the current version of the product, at least in terms of the major release number to the version of the product that you're looking to purchase. If this isn't the case, the ACR might not reflect the accessibility correctly for what you're analyzing for purchase. If semantic versioning is not used for your product, the date in the ACR can help you determine how representative it is of the current product. Consider the type of product it is when you're analyzing how old the ACR is. Hardware is updated less frequently, so the date might be a year or more old and it's still current. For web-based products, a year-old ACR is more likely to be out of date and not necessarily reflecting the current accessibility status of the product. If you think you need an updated ACR, you should be able to use the contact information to get help on obtaining a more current ACR. In some cases, the updated ACR might not be readily available, but you can just ask them when it might be. Step 4, determine how a product was tested. To find out about what accessibility testing was performed on the product, read through the evaluation methods used part of the ACR. The notes might also provide some testing information. Sometimes it might include the name of a third-party testing company that performed the testing, and it might also indicate whether the testers included people with disabilities. The ACR could also indicate what types of tests were performed: automated testing, manual testing, which could include tool-assisted testing, visual inspection, and manual operation. Comments might also include if the product was tested with one or more assistive technologies and what those assistive technologies were, and whether or not there was any user testing performed by persons with disabilities. If the testing information is incomplete, it should raise red flags. Automated testing does not fully cover accessibility with any tool. So if only automated testing is identified, the report is not likely to be an accurate reflection of the product's accessibility. Manual testing should include testing with using only a keyboard. There are some tools or test methodologies that help with manual testing, so any details about manual testing tools or approaches should give you more confidence in the conformance information in the ACR. There are a number of assistive technologies that can be tested with, including screen readers, screen magnifiers, voice recognition, switches, and so on. User testing by persons with disabilities, while it's not required, is also a relevant indicator that the results reported in the ACR are likely to be more accurate. Step 5, do you have all the ACRs that you need? Some products integrate multiple subproducts within individual ACRs for the different parts. This means you would need to gather all of the relevant ACRs to fully assess the accessibility of the overall product. If you have questions about which ACRs are relevant, contact the vendor for help. Step 6, know what criteria are required. Defects of any kind are common in all products, including accessibility defects. If you know the broad range of users that you'll have, it can help you key into the relevant criteria and potentially help you disqualify vendors that don't reach your preferred minimum level of accessibility. You can use the functional performance mappings to identify which users might be most impacted by the issues listed in the report. Step 7, reading the conformance tables. When you read conformance tables, the conformance level and remarks and explanations columns should help you determine what requirements are or are not fully supported by the product. When the remarks and explanations are well written, they should give you enough information to help you understand what the issues are and how they might impact users. What's next for the VPAT, and how can you stay informed of the changes? The VPAT's planning another update when the next version of the EN 301549 is finalized as the harmonized standard for the European Accessibility Act. You can stay informed on updates on the VPAT, WCAG, and EN 301549 by using the respective links that are available in the presentation deck. We have a number of resources available with links. You can download this presentation from ITI's VPAT training webpage at www.itic.org/policy/accessibility/VPAT-training. The resource links can be found on the second last slide of the deck. And we want to give big thanks to the companies that have contributed to this presentation, including IBM, Google, Adobe, Microsoft, Intel, and HP.
Thank you so much, Steve and Mary Jo, for that fantastic presentation. We will now take a 5-minute break and we'll have a timer on the screen. And then after we return from the 5-minute break, we will answer all the incredible questions you all submitted in our Q&A. So thank you so much for doing that. And we'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, everyone. I hope everybody had a good break and everybody can hear me. And we will move on to answer some questions. So, for those of you who just joined, my name is Julie Zaklis-Antow, and I lead the accessibility work at the Information Technology Industry Council, who is putting on this presentation and training today. Without any further ado, we're going to move on to some of the questions we received. And this is actually one we receive a lot through emails. And if you do have any questions, feel free to email us later too. But there's always a lot of questions in terms of the timing of filling out VPAT. How much time does one take to do so? How much time does one need? So, Mary Jo, I was wondering if you could give us some insight into that.
I'm sorry, I was looking at the thing. What was the question again?
How much time does one need, slash, how much time does one need to set aside to fill out the VPAT? How long does that normally take?
Yes. So that all depends on a number of factors. The size and complexity of your product, and what it includes. Does it have hardware, software, documentation? Is there a web-based software or website, and support services? And so you have to consider whether you've already performed your accessibility testing on all these aspects of your product and service. If not, you need to do the testing first before you even attempt to fill out the VPAT. And that might take you a bit of time to actually test. So the more full-featured the product, the more testing and assimilation of the test results have to happen, to make sure that there's a clear and accurate picture of the accessibility conformance to the requirements. So once the test results are understood, you know what the accessibility issues are and what will not be addressed before you release your product, you can fill out your VPAT. And so, filling out the actual form is probably the simplest and quickest part of that whole process.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. I really appreciate it. Question for Steve. If I need to report on two different standards, such as 508 and EN 301549, do I need multiple VPATs? How would I go about that?
So you shouldn't really need them. You might have a request, like a specific request from someone to say, please give us if they're looking for something for the revised Section 508 standard, they might ask, please submit a 508 edition VPAT. In my experience, an INT edition, which includes the 508 conformance information, would always really be accepted in that because it has all of the criteria that are included in the 508. And actually, some places might actually prefer that because it also lets them see how their product conforms to, the WCAG 2.1 or WCAG 2.2 template standards as well. So there might be cases where you might be specifically asked for an addition, but you could always reach out to them and say, we have all of this conformance reported in the INT edition of the template. Is that okay? And in my experience, that's always been acceptable.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. Mary Jo, this one's for you, and it's on a similar vein. We have someone here who works at the state government level, and they're asking if they should use WCAG or Section 508 versions of the VPAT since the product is only for state residents.
Well, it all depends upon your state policy because actually most states have an accessibility policy, as well as what you're trying to meet. If you're doing procurement of a variety of technology, including hardware, 508 is probably a appropriate standard to use for that. But if you're just worrying about the accessibility of websites and things like that for the government, a an ACR on WCAG would probably be more appropriate. So it all just depends on what your state requires, which I don't know what state it is, and I don't know all of the state policies offhand, but you do have to just kind of base that on what you are required to meet.
Thanks. And this one's for either one, whoever wants to answer. We got a couple of questions asking for a good rubric for deciding between partially supports or does not support, or any metrics or measurement standards or terms that could be used for supports, does not support, and partially supports. I was wondering if the two of you could jump in and give us a little more clarity on that.
So it is a tricky question. It's somewhat interpretation, right, of what you want to say. But to me, whether you're choosing does not support or partially supports, I think a lot of it you have to consider what is the effect on the user? Can they not use the technology at all? Are they completely blocked from major functionality? I would say does not support, right? It partially supports is more towards the vein of, we have really tried to make accessibility, a focus. We're working on it. We have made great strides in making the product accessible. And yeah, we have some issues and we can document them. And especially if there's workarounds and things like that, document them. I think the documentation of what your problems are, how it affects the user, and if there's any workarounds is super important. That kind of qualifies what answer you give.
Yeah, I think just to second that, I think it's important to just kind of remember what is the purpose of these reports? The purpose is for purchasers to be able to make an informed decision on the accessibility of a product for their users. So with that sort of context in mind, I think that can really help determine between some of these categories on if functionality is not available at all to users because of accessibility issues, then you need to factor that into your report.
Awesome. Mary Jo, are the WCAG accessibility standards and guidelines consistent across web and mobile OS?
So this is kind of an interesting question because um, I would have to say that WCAG, not in 508, their application of WCAG, they actually have exceptions for some of the criteria, and the same for the EN 301549. So when it's mobile native, which is non-web version of your software, mobile software. So for those, some of those criteria won't necessarily be applied, but the rest of the WCAG standards pretty much apply consistently and in there. So I think that's about the best answer I can give.
Thank you. Now, Steve, this one's for you. Regarding third-party product testing, how can we tell if a user can determine whether a third-party integration is a separate product or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sometimes it can be really tricky. I think to kind of give a more obvious example, if I think when I brought this up in the presentation, I was using maybe an example of like the checkout process of an online marketplace. If if you have like an integration with a third-party payment platform or something like that, but all of that process is completed within your user interface, and generally it is maybe a specific button or a confirmation window, then you should be reporting on that. You should be testing it, reporting it, because um, it still is your interface that's using it. But if you are completing a checkout process and it actually, let's say, opens up a new window to a third-party payment platform website, that could change a week after you have implemented that into your product, and you have absolutely no control over the accessibility or the markup of that. Then it makes more sense to ask them for an accessibility conformance report and update your report with a link to where they can find the latest version of that report. In some cases, this might be a little bit more tricky, but generally, my recommendation is that if it's something that your product team has some control over, and you are able to address any of those accessibility issues, that should be reported within your within your product.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. And hopefully whoever submitted that question does too. Mary Jo, since you have incredible experience with WCAG, one of the questions submitted asks, who will decide which WCAG version and level to follow and on what basis?
So once again, this is up to, it depends on which side of the fence you're on. If you're procuring, it's all in the policy that you're trying to meet. And so you'll require in your request for bids, whatever WCAG version is required in your region, I would imagine, that you're trying to meet. And if you are a product team, it depends on where you're offering your product, who you're offering your product to. So you need to investigate what is required and what is being used. My biggest recommendation is typically level AA of whatever WCAG version you do choose to use, because most regulations worldwide only require up to level AA. So that means including all the level A and AA criteria.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Something also for you. In terms of the remarks and explanations section, is it appropriate to say that the criteria partially supports and that the product team is currently working to make the product more accessible in the future?
Well, I guess that depends. On the current level of testing and support that you have. If you have made strides in making things accessible and there's not like complete blockers to someone with a disability using whatever it is you're creating, whether it's a website or an application or whatever technology it is. But you can put in your remarks and explanations or in your notes somewhere that say, or in, with a bid, that we do care about accessibility. You could, if it's a website, you could make an accessibility statement and say, hey, we are working towards making this website accessible. This is the standard we want to work towards. You don't necessarily have to give a date, but yes, it's a priority and it is a focus for us. And so if you're transparent about that, it's more helpful.
Thank you. And for either of you, if the same accessibility issue appears on multiple pages, how should one go about mentioning that explanation? Would it be mentioning it once? Would it be mentioning throughout it? And would it need to require a creation of a new VPAT for each page, or is one document enough for an entire website?
I can start with this. So, I mean, keep in mind the VPAT is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. So it's not a voluntary page accessibility template, or else procurement people would probably have nightmares about how many they would need to review to determine how accessible a product is. So I would say that the Accessibility Conformance Report using the VPAT should be representative of the product's accessibility and the parts of the product that will be used. So that, as we mentioned in the presentation, that includes, for example, for a website, it would include not only the website, but also product documentation and support services and things that your users would actually be able to use and interact with and consume.
Thank you so much, Steve. And this question actually came up twice, so I'm consolidating two questions. This one is also for you, Steve. If this person is a reseller or creating an ACR on behalf of a client, should the contact section show the client's email or whoever is completing it? Or should the product's manufacturer? Who would be responsible for that?
So I'm curious if Mary Jo has a different take on this, but there's a distinction that I'd like to draw between who is responsible for the accessibility of the product and who is a contact information in a situation of, let's say, a reseller. And as a reseller, you typically would not have the ability to directly change or fix accessibility issues in the product. So if that is the case, then if you were a reseller and you were providing the accessibility conformance reports that were provided by the manufacturer, those reports would have the accessibility contact information of the manufacturer. I haven't been in this situation too many times myself, so I think that in a situation like this, I would just imagine that the the end purchaser, would have that contact information of the reseller. But in that situation, I would also assume that they would be able to contact the original manufacturer for more information with the accessibility issues in the report.
Yeah, I don't have anything different to add to that. Honestly, if whoever's manufacturing it is best equipped to test and report on the accessibility of their product and then pass that information on to any reseller so that they can either incorporate it or, provide it separately. When they're reselling like a bundle of whole bunch of products, they can provide the ACRs for all of them. And then all of that information is correct by the manufacturer. I don't think a reseller should have to test all of that unless they're making major modifications or additions, then that part they would have to test and report on.
Thank you so much, the two of you. And another question we received in a similar vein on completing the VPAT. We know that there are several companies out there advertising services to complete the VPAT. Do you need to use one of those services, or can VPATs be completed by whoever?
Well, if your company has a really good understanding of accessibility and they've done the work to make the product accessible and they also know how to test for it, then, completing it, doing all the testing and completing the VPAT and creating an ACR yourself is perfectly fine. Otherwise, there are consulting companies that can help you get educated, do the testing for you, and some of them actually will fill out an ACR for you, and that may be a quicker route. But it comes at a cost, so you have to weigh time versus cost, and whether or not your team has the chops to do all of that accessibility work and test and reporting.
Yeah, and I'd just maybe add on that ultimately it is the product manufacturer's responsibility for the accuracy of the report as well. So ultimately, that all falls on the product vendor for that. So if they are getting a third party to test their products, you can kind of, I guess, come to whatever determination you want on that. There is something to be said about what Mary Jo had mentioned. If you are completing these reports in-house, then at least you are aware of all of the issues that are present in the report, and that your team is aware of them, and that you have at least a certain level of accessibility knowledge to be able to identify them and hopefully resolve them. But I wouldn't necessarily put like, it's definitely not required to use a third-party company for it. But if you do not have that type of expertise in your company and it's not something that you're able to take on, then those companies can be helpful in navigating through that process.
Thanks. And Steve, another question for you on making decisions about the VPAT. The question came in asking about Section 508 and 301549 and adding them in a single table. Does it depend on which organization, or is there such a table that they can combine for A, AA, and AAA?
So I wouldn't recommend combining like, let's say, the revised Section 508 standard and the EN table like together. I think that's kind of maybe potentially missing the point on who is going to be reading these. In a lot of situations, the person reading the accessibility conformance report will be looking to determine in a procurement process, how well does this product fit the requirements of our organization or government or something like that. And I don't know offhand of anyone who actually has a requirement for both EN 301549 and revised section 508. So if you were to combine those into a single table, that is putting a lot of burden on some procurement professionals who likely don't necessarily even, like in many cases, might not even really understand the significance of accessibility criteria. And as I mentioned in the presentation, a lot of the time these are used to compare products against each other. And I think that it's probably in everyone's best interest to try to make, the one of the great value, one of the greatest values of using the VPAT is that you're providing a standardized template that makes it easier to compare products as part of this. So if you're going to radically change it in a way that makes it more difficult for people to be able to compare that, it's probably not the best idea for you participating in that process.
Thanks, Steve. Super helpful. And if you're responding to a government solicitation that doesn't specify which VPAT to use, what should they do?
Well, it depends on what government, right? And what standards are being required in that government. So really it all boils down to what's the jurisdiction, right? What are their regulated standards that they are required to adhere to? And that gives you a clue into what VPAT edition to use, and what level, what versions of the standards to use. But as we said earlier in the presentation, when in doubt, use the int version, report to everything, and then that will widen your customer base. Now, if you're in a particular government and trying to do this, then you'll know what standards you're supposed to be meeting.
And Mary Jo, since I have you right here, this one's also for you. The U.S. Access Board outlines the WCAG mapping to the FPCs. How can this be used in place of filling out the 508 tables?
Well, I would say no, because of the fact that in 508, the functional performance criteria are actually stated to be used in two cases. One is if you're claiming equivalent facilitation, because you can't meet the standard as required, but you have some other way to do it. Or if the 508 standards don't cover the type aspects of your technology, like it doesn't even have accessibility requirements for certain aspects of your technology. It was kind of a way to future-proof 508 for all these technologies that keep marching on, and standards take a while to catch up sometimes. So I would say do not use the FPC instead of the 508 tables. Use the 508 tables, please.
Thanks, Mary Jo. One is for the both of you, but should VPATs be completed for products and websites that are free and available to all users who don't need to follow the procurement process? For example, if a tool is provided by a government agency for public use, is a VPAT needed? Mary Jo, I see you thinking.
I'm thinking, definitively, I'm not sure I can answer that, but I would say probably not. If it's just something that's freely available, it doesn't mean that you don't have to meet standards if you're providing it to the public, right? But it doesn't mean that you have to actually fill out a VPAT, but you would probably want to, in some way, make sure that it's accessible, make sure that internally, whoever is producing this has an idea of the accessibility status of this thing, and they might need to provide some additional support or some things so that if someone has accessibility issues that they can report it. making an accessibility statement. I've seen those around. Accessibility statements are a good way to, show that you're that you want to do accessibility, that it's important to you. You can say what standards you want to meet. There's all kinds of information, ways for people to submit issues. And then that's helpful to the users, especially if it's publicly available, that they can get some support if needed.
Yeah, I also think that there's maybe an area that we can't directly speak to, which is maybe the compliance aspect of this, which is what is required. What are the requirements of documents or websites or products that the government provides to people? There might be some requirements there where, yes, they would actually need to test and make sure that those meet a certain benchmark of accessibility. That could vary, depending on where you are in the world. So since we can't really answer that, assuming that that's not the case, the answer is probably not. But at the same time, you might want to, there still could be value in disclosing this. A lot of the time, products that are freely available will provide ACRs based on VPAT to the public and make them publicly available. So users that that read them can have a better understanding of where some potential barriers might be in their usage of it.
Thanks, Steve. Mary Jo, how often should one be updating the ACR, and under what circumstances, in terms of changes to products, would require an ACR update?
I think we covered this a little bit in the presentation earlier, but just to kind of reiterate, updating your ACRs would have to, it would depend on like what type of product it is. If it's hardware, obviously hardware doesn't change that often. So, only when your hardware gets updated should you need it.
Steve,
I'm
do you
sorry.
want,
I think Steve's gonna have to.
Steve, do you want to jump in?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. How often should one be updating their ACR, and under what circumstances warrant that a product require an ACR update?
I think like my general answer to this is usually when the accessibility of the product has changed. So I know that this can be a bit different depending on the type of product, as Mary Jo did mention there. But yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, anytime that you fix an accessibility issue in your product, you should be able to update that. And if you can move a criterion from partially supports to supports, like why not update that, and why not show that you are actively working on this. I think one thing I didn't necessarily mention when during the presentation, when like how to read an ACR, we did talk a little bit about things like semantic versioning, and when that's not really available, like on a lot of web products, you can use the date of the report. And if you see that the date of the report is extremely recent, that can really help give you more confidence that this report is more representative of like the product that is currently being used than a report that might be a year old. So if you are making fixes to your product that will impact the accessibility of the product, I would recommend updating it as frequently as you can. And this, unfortunately, also goes the other way. If you are introducing new accessibility issues, it's important for people to, be able to find that represented in the report. But I understand in some cases that's not always possible, but that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. And in a similar vein, we have a question about how often owners should be updating their testing against WCAG standards. Was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight.
For me, I think that you should be testing accessibility throughout, the entire process. We were, I think early in this presentation, we talked about this a little bit, but the whole process of filling out a VPAT is a lot easier and faster and eliminates a lot of surprises if you are testing and planning for accessibility as early in that process as possible. So if you don't want to get to a point where you don't do any accessibility testing until you're about to release and then find out that you have a lot of barriers and you'll have, a lot of does not support in your ACR. And, you're only catching that at a time where you're about to release it. And, in some cases that, it's still valuable to release it, but, you don't want to have to be dealing with these issues that far down the line. So I would recommend integrating accessibility testing into each stage of your product development process.
Including design. So even there are certain aspects of WCAG that can be addressed in your designs. So, it's important to, start thinking about it early and throughout the process. There's certain aspects that are, responsibilities of coders, but yeah, if you split the responsibilities, it's not all in one person. You can address things as early as you can, and will typically wind up with a much more accessible result. And then if you're trying to update to new standards, you'll have to decide, when you want to make that cutover to support new standards, find out what the new requirements are and impact on your product, and then begin to incorporate those requirements and testing into your processes through the design and dev and testing phases of whatever you're working on.
And Mary Jo, you mentioned multiple phases of testing and phases, and we have a question here of how important is it for an evaluation to be done by an unbiased professional third party?
It can be quite helpful to have a third party, but I mean, there are also caveats. If you've got a pretty complex product, they might not have an understanding of how it works and what the functionality is. So I think you would have to kind of partner. If you wanted a professional to do some testing, you have to partner with them and make sure that they understand the user flows and tasks that can be done and how that happens and what aspects need to be tested. So I guess that's my answer to that. And we answered previously questions about, do you have to have third-party testing? No, you don't necessarily have to. Within IBM, there's actually a combination. We have so many products in IBM. Some teams, they don't have the accessibility chops and they know it, or they don't have the time to do all the accessibility testing. So they'll hire either outside of IBM or within IBM. We have a team that does accessibility testing. And so they'll ship it off to them and they work together to get the product tested. So it all depends on, your budget, your time, your capabilities. So it varies.
Thank you for that complete answer. We actually had another question about who typically fills out a VPAT, so I feel like that's a perfect way to answer that too. This is one of, I'm sure, the three of ours favorite questions to receive, and I know I get it all the time asking if ITI or somebody else can certify a VPAT or if there is a VPAT certification, and if so, how one can get their product certified. So, what is your answer to that, Mary Jo?
There is no certification. And we said that on one of the slides. I just want to reiterate, some people might advertise that they certify. It's not like UL certification for electrical safety, right? You have to have, somebody experienced in testing for accessibility, for sure, testing your thing. And they do test to make sure as much as possible your product conforms to the accessibility standards. And so just knowing that you can test to conformance to the best of your ability, and certification is not a thing.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Mary.
if I can add on to that, it's just like certification just doesn't make sense in products that can be updated dozens of times in a single day. Because as I mentioned before, with like how often should you be doing WCAG testing? Well, in some cases, like the testing, if you let's say you have a website that receives dozens of updates in a day, or even a handful of them, ideally you're doing WCAG testing of those before they're released. And anytime that you would have a change to that would seemingly invalidate any certification. Like that's just not really a feasible thing, unlike some other types of product certifications that have, things that don't change. If you're releasing something that is going to be stable and have no changes over a 2-year period, maybe in a situation like that, you could develop some sort of certification system, but it just doesn't really apply for most of the types of situations that a VPAT would be involved in.
Thanks, Steve. And I know you talked about best practices and filling out the VPAT. And we got one question here asking, what is the best way to describe the scope of the evaluation? And they gave a particular example. So, for example, to explain which samples were tested to produce the results, was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight here.
Yeah. So if you use an established evaluation system like the WCAG EM, the WCAG evaluation methodology, as an example, you can provide a link to the WCAG EM page and say we used the WCAG evaluation. I've had reports before where we would provide a lot of detail and say we selected 35 representative samples of a website, and we also had a dozen random samples, and that is how we tested this report, and the results of this report are reflective of these samples. If you don't have that, then I would just encourage you to provide as much detail as you can about how you scoped the testing, because really keep in mind how this is going to be received. If you have a product that is extremely complex and has lots of different pages and templates, or lots of different components and functionality, but you only list a homepage as being tested, then the person that's reading it is going to think, okay, well, this actually doesn't seem to really fit the needs of the functionality that we are looking for. So I need to evaluate products where the functionality that I need is actually represented in the report. I hope that answers it.
I think it does. So thank you so much, Steve. Now I'm just going to take a couple seconds to talk to you all. And I know we've been kind of hinting at this throughout the presentation and basically talking about this, but we do have a new VPAT 2.5 Rev that is already live on our website. And I would love to turn it over to Mary Jo to really answer what is new in VPAT 2.5 Rev and why should we or why should anybody use it?
Okay, so VPAT 2.5 Rev, we got some feedback from users of how they were a little confused about things like the evaluation methods used, and they were getting some ACRs that were just copying some basic information from our instructions as their answer to evaluation methods used. So we made improvements saying, you really need to give some details, a little bit more information. Don't copy what's here, kind of thing, because evaluators want to actually know what processes or what methods you've used to test. Does it include users with disability? Whatever you can provide as far as how you tested, it helps them to understand, do you really understand, whoever tested it really understand accessibility? Do they really understand the requirements, and do they have a process, and are they using an established process for testing? There are some out there. And so you document that. Some of the other things were really purely editorial. We just had some editorial changes. There was some changes in the tables, a few anomalies that occurred in the tables. No change in requirements, none, no new standards, nothing like that. It's all purely editorial changes within the template part of it itself in the tables. And so you can pick that up and then you can get the latest update. It's not any change from the VPAT 2.5 requirements though. So just putting that out there. The next update will be a full point, probably a point release when we do the EN 301549, which we'll finish at some point this year, I hope.
And if one were wanting to see, for example, all the changes in one place, is there a
Oh,
document that
yes.
would?
Yeah. I forgot to mention that. Yes, we do have like a change log that's available on the ITI website. So it's a file and we mark down it for every change to the VPAT version. We put in what's changed for each edition. And so you can peruse that and see what has changed there.
Amazing. And we're almost at time. So I have one last, but certainly not least question for you, Mary Jo.
Sure.
Where does someone go to get more information on the VPAT or to find a recording of this presentation and the slides that were presented here today?
Yes. The that is available from the ITI website. They have a VPAT page, www.itic.org/policy/accessibility/VPAT. And once you're on that page, you can also see there's a link to the training. So that's on a separate page, but it's all available initially from that VPAT page. You can get the VPAT 2.5 Rev. You can see the change log. All that stuff is all there and available to you.
And I just got a last question wanting to know from Steve where they can get an Art I Heart WCAG pin because they love it. So
Yeah, I'm wearing a yellow I Heart WCAG pin. I believe I got this at a accessibility event in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, many years ago. So a shout out to my local A11YTO meetup group and conferences. I believe this might have come from, I think it might have been the government of Ontario setting up a booth there. And because I also had a My Ontario is Accessible pin, but I couldn't find that one today. But I don't know where to get these now. Actually, it says on it ontario.ca/accesson. So it was from the Ontario government. So shout out to my provincial government.
and your final reminder to love WCAG, EN 301549, Section 508, and everything, all the standards related to accessibility. But on a more personal note, and what I love and what I would like to thank on behalf of ITI, a huge thanks to Steve and Mary Jo for their countless hours of dedication. This is a labor of over 6 months of work. So thank you so much for the two of you and the entire committee for everything you all have put forth. Thank you to each and every one of you for attending and sticking around for this almost 2 hour long training, which, as we did say, as Mary Jo did say, will be available as a recording on our website alongside VPAT 2.5 Rev and the slides that were presented here today. My contact information is also at the bottom of that website, which we will send in a link to you after this webinar is done. So please, if you have any and all remaining questions, we will be keeping all the questions that were submitted and we'll be likely compiling them either into a Q&A or a separate document. So thank you so much for sending all of those in. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. And I hope to see you all next time because we will have, as Mary Jo said, we will definitely have some more updates in the next year. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.